Hello there, I'm John Caruso and welcome to our Automotive Industries Insights series. And today we'll be speaking to Brett Mills, a dealer principal with Ken Mills, Toyota, Nambour and Maroochydore. I wanted to understand, you talked about the standards that we have here in Australia. How do they compare to other markets like European and the US market, North America? Do we have different standards, Brett?
I think the principal way that the required reduction in tailpipe emissions is working, and it's imposed upon either a manufacturer or importer, is relatively similar in most developed markets around the world. In saying that, the standards aren't a carbon copy, and I think the governments around the world have tried to recognise that the goal is the same in terms of carbon reduction, but the markets are different. What's different in Australia is our standard is actually very aggressive. The required reduction in carbon output is fast, and the point where the government is wanting to get to is very low. When you look at some other markets around the world, particularly in Australia, where we have a fairly big country, and if you looked at the current way that Australians consume vehicles versus what would need to be consumed if every importer chose to comply, the way the market looks is very different to what consumers are sort of choosing to buy currently. You know, what happens around the world is actually really important because, for example, under the Trump administration, they're starting to wind back their emission requirements. So they're making the standards a little easier for the manufacturers and importers. In parts of Europe, there has been legislation which was not necessarily around carbon emissions, but it was about mandating EVs. That's been wound back. The car industry in general, by the way, doesn't want a specific type of technology to be hard-coded into legislation. It's about trying to reduce carbon, not about mandating the use of a particular type of technology. And this is simply because the car industry in general believes that there's innovative ways that carbon emissions can be met, and different types of technologies, maybe even some haven't been thought of yet, right? So there's generally speaking a desire from the industry to let us work out how to reduce tailpipe emissions.
This sounds, you talked about the US and what we're seeing with the current government over there. Does this mean that different governments might change emission standards, and does that make it hard for car manufacturers?
I think what makes it hard, I don't really want to talk about brands, but I'll use Ford as an example, right? Ford is obviously a US car manufacturer, and I'm guessing that's their most significant market. But I think Australia is actually quite important for them as well. And so I would, again, I'm making assumptions, but assume that Australia is a less significant market for them than the US. But in the US, which is their big domestic market, is kind of saying, hey, we're happy at this level, but a small right-hand drive market on the other side of the world is saying, but we want you to make this standard. And I think that's the type of complexity that gets that the manufacturers are having to deal with. I could probably talk on this topic for a long time. There's the consequences of the legislation are very wide-reaching when you start looking at how vehicles are built, the supply chains, and then when they come into a country like Australia, all of the work that's done to distribute them, particularly into rural and regional parts of a country like Australia. For example, the business model that's being presented to dealers by some of the EV builders, I would think is going to be very difficult to be a viable model for dealers in really small and rural parts of Australia. So it's not just the car builders, it's actually also the logistics and the supply chains, and then the distribution networks in each country and in Australia. Like, how is that going to play out over time, I think is interesting.
Toyota.